Wyoming Territory. 1879. The wagon jerked to a stop so fast the dust kept moving even after the horses didn't. "You can get off now, miss," the driver barked, voice flat and final. Clementine Rosewood blinked beneath her bonnet, struggling to understand. I don't understand. We are not in Trapper's Ridge yet. Why are we stopping?" "You talk too much," he said, spitting into the dirt. "Been hollerin' since Nebraska. The boys are sick of it." Clementine looked around at the other passengers, hollow-eyed women, two solemn-faced preachers, a freckled boy chewing jerky. No one met her gaze. She felt her cheeks burn. "You all agreed to take me to my husband-to-be." "Well, maybe he wants a quiet wife," the driver said. "Maybe he did not ask for a mouth that never stops." Something inside her cracked. "I was trying to be friendly. I was trying to off," he said again, and one of the older men was already reaching for her trunk. She stumbled down from the wagon, skirts catching on the wheel. The wind pulled at her hat strings and her boots hit dry dirt with a sound that felt like a door slamming shut. They left her there without another word. The wagon creaked off, the dust swallowing their tracks almost immediately. Clementine stood alone on the side of the trail, her trunk beside her, and nothing but open prairie and wind in every direction. She was 26, unmarried, and now, apparently, too loud for even a mail-order marriage. She sat on her trunk and stared at the horizon. She had come from Missouri with nothing but a name in a letter, Mr. Thomas Bell of Trapper's Ridge, and a hope that maybe, just maybe, she could start over. But now she was just another woman left behind. A distant clip of hooves broke through her thoughts. One rider, coming from the west. Her breath caught. She stood, brushed her skirts, and tried not to look as desperate as she felt. The rider slowed when he saw her. A tall man, lean but broad through the shoulders, with a tan coat and a dust-covered hat pulled low. His horse was a deep bay, steady and calm. He stopped a few feet from her and looked down. "You all right, ma'am?" "No," she said, voice cracking. "I was thrown off the wagon." He dismounted in one smooth motion. "Thrown off? For being too loud," she muttered. The man pulled off his gloves slowly. His eyes were a striking green and his face was sun-seared and serious. But there was something kind in his voice when he asked, "Too loud for what?" "For existing, I suppose." He glanced at the road where the wagon had disappeared, then back at her. "You headed to Trapper's Ridge?" "Yes." He nodded once. "I am too. Name's Gideon Darr. Clementine Rosewood." She tried to smile. "I was supposed to be married when I got there." He looked at her a moment, then reached for her trunk. "Well, come on then. I will get you there." She blinked. "Just like that?" He shrugged. "I do not figure a woman should be left by the road like a sack of flour." Her breath caught again, but for a different reason. She followed him to his horse, and he helped her up behind him, her arms awkward around his waist. They rode in silence for a while. The prairie stretched wide and gold around them, broken only by the occasional rise of rock or a far-off line of cottonwoods. His horse moved smooth and steady beneath them, and Clementine found herself watching the way Gideon rode, easy, like he was born in the saddle. "You really do not mind the company?" she asked after a while. "I do not mind," he said simply. "You talk a lot, but you say good things." She smiled into his back. "That is the nicest thing anyone has said to me in days." They reached Trapper's Ridge by sundown. It was a small town, mostly clapboard buildings and one main street, with a saloon, a church, and a mercantile. Gideon stopped in front of the livery. "I will see to the horse." "You wait here," he said, helping her down. She stood there, watching him disappear into the livery, wondering how a man so quiet could make her feel so safe. He came back a few minutes later and nodded toward the street. "Let us find Thomas Bell." She followed him down the wooden walkway. Her heart was pounding. The letter had been short. "Thomas Bell, widower, owns a small home, seeks wife for companionship and help with children." They knocked on the door of a weathered gray house. A boy answered. Freckled, maybe 10. He stared at her, then at Gideon. "Is your father home?" Gideon asked. The boy hesitated. "You are looking for Pa?" "Yes," Clementine said, stepping forward. "I am Clementine Rosewood." The boy's face changed. "Miss Rosewood? Pa is not here. He left." Gideon frowned. "Left?" The boy nodded. "Took the wagon and went to Cheyenne. Said he changed his mind." Clementine's stomach dropped. Where's your mother? Gideon asked gently. She died last winter. Clementine crouched down. And you are here alone? The boy looked down. My sister is inside. She is 5. Gideon looked toward the house. You two have been alone since your father left? The boy nodded, ashamed. Clementine stood, shoulders straightening. Well, that changes things. Gideon looked at her. What are you thinking? I am not leaving them alone. You do not know them. I do not need to. They need someone. He studied her a long moment. Then, quietly, you are not what I expected. She smiled. Neither are you. Gideon helped them settle in that night. He fixed the broken hinge on the door while Clementine cooked what little food the children had left. Little Abigail clung to her skirts, and Andrew, the older boy, watched everything with careful eyes. After the children were asleep, she and Gideon sat on the porch in silence, the stars stretching wide above them. You came out here to marry someone, he said finally. Now he is gone. Yes, she said, voice soft. But maybe I found someone better. He turned to her, green eyes steady in the dark. You do not even know me. I know you stopped for me. You helped me when no one else would. She paused. That counts for a lot. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, I have a claim a few miles out. It is nothing fancy, but I built it myself. It is solid. I was not planning on marrying. He looked at her. But I could change my mind. Her heart caught. I could give you a place, he said. And those children too, if you want them. I would not stop you. Clementine stared at him. Are you asking? I am saying I would want it, he said simply. You, them, a home. Tears filled her eyes, and she nodded once. Yes, she whispered. Gideon reached for her hand, and she took it. The wind shifted on the third morning, carrying the scent of pine and damp bark from the hills west of town. Clementine stood at the pump behind Thomas Bell's house, sleeves rolled, hands chilled by the slow rhythm of drawing up water. Inside, Abigail sang to herself in a whispery murmur while she stirred flour and lard with a wooden spoon. Andrew had gone with Gideon at sunup to mend the pasture fence behind the church where the rails had sagged through the spring thaw. Clementine watched the water spill into the pail and thought of how much could change in 3 days. She still wore the same boots she'd stepped off the wagon in, scuffed and cracked, but her hands had already taken the shape of the work here, blistered at the first joints, ring finger rubbed raw from the washboard. She carried the bucket inside, setting it gently on the table. Abigail, brow furrowed in concentration, had managed something biscuit-shaped. Did you use the salt this time? Clementine asked, drying her hands. I think so. You think? Abigail reached for the tin and frowned. This one. That's the baking soda. Oh. Clementine crouched beside her. We'll try again. It's all practice. Abigail nodded solemnly, then handed her the spoon like it was a baton in a race. Clementine took it and stirred gently, careful not to bruise the dough. The child leaned against her side, small and warm, and Clementine felt something steady settle in her chest. The door creaked open. Gideon stepped inside, hat in hand, boots caked with dry clay. He paused when he saw them, then gave a short nod. Fence is done. Andrew's with Reverend Mallory. He's letting him help whitewash the back wall. Clementine stood, brushing the flour from her skirts. Did the boards hold? Well enough. Some need replacing before winter. There's a stack of old cedar behind the livery. Mallory says we can take what's sound. She nodded, then stepped toward the hearth. We've biscuits if you're hungry. I'm always hungry. He sat at the table, stretching his legs under the bench. Abigail climbed up beside him and leaned on his arm like she'd always belonged there. He didn't flinch or shift, just reached for the biscuit and tore a piece off, offering the first bite to her. Clementine watched them a moment, then turned back to the fire. I've been thinking, Gideon said, voice low, about the land I've got. She glanced over her shoulder. What about it? It's too much for one man, and more than enough for 4. I've got a spring, a small orchard, apples mostly, some plum. Cabin's got a loft. I've been sleeping downstairs, but the top's clean and dry. She stirred the pot slower. You're saying we could come with you. I'm saying you'd be welcome. He didn't look at her when he said it, just kept his eyes on the biscuit. breaking it into smaller pieces for Abigail. She turned, wiping her hands. "What would I be to you if I did?" He looked up then. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady. "You'd be my wife." Clementine took that in. The words didn't ring with ceremony, but they landed with weight. She stepped closer, resting one hand on the table's edge. "You're sure you want that?" "I wouldn't have said it if I wasn't." She studied him. His face was sun-lined, the kind that didn't crack under pressure. Not handsome in the way of stories, but honest, cut from something solid. "I don't come quiet," she said. "I've got opinions, and I don't always wait to be asked." "I know. I was raised in a boarding house. My mother ran it after my father died. I learned to make change before I learned to sew. I don't know how to be meek. I don't need meek." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "And the children? I figure they're already halfway yours." Abigail leaned into his side with a sleepy hum, and Clementine felt something open in her chest that hadn't breathed in years. "All right," she said. He nodded once and stood, lifting Abigail into his arms with practiced ease. Clementine fetched her shawl and stepped into the yard with him, the light slanting low through the cottonwoods. They walked to the edge of town together, past the dry creek bed and the schoolhouse under repair. The trail toward Gideon's land curved north, skirting the base of a low hill. He pointed to it with his chin. "We'll pass the old stage stop. There's a well there, still clean. We can rest the mare." She nodded, adjusting the bag over her shoulder. They'd packed what little they needed in the wagon Gideon had borrowed from the livery blankets, flour, the 2 books Andrew wouldn't leave behind. As they walked, Clementine traced her fingers along the edge of the canvas seat, then glanced at Gideon. "You ever been married?" He shook his head. "No. Came close, once. She left for Idaho with her brother. Said I made her feel like she was waiting on something that wouldn't come." "Did you agree?" "I didn't argue." She studied his face. "And now?" He looked at her, then reached for her hand, calloused palm warm against hers. "Now I know what I was waiting for." No one spoke after that. The sound of the wheels over earth, the creak of the harness, and the hush of the wind through wild sage carried them forward into the land that would soon be theirs. The wagon creaked as it rolled into the clearing, wheels dipping in the soft ruts of last week's rain. Clementine held the reins, her gloves damp where the leather had worn thin. Gideon walked beside the mare, leading her with one hand near the bit, his other resting on the stock of his rifle. Not for danger, there'd been no sign of that, but because the path narrowed here, and the rabbits that darted across the scrub had a way of startling the horse. The cabin came into view just as the sun eased past its peak, light warming the face of the pine-planked walls. It sat against the rise of the hill, shaded by 2 cottonwoods that still clung to the last of their early leaves. A small lean-to stood to the left, and between them the scent of smoke drifted faint from the chimney. "That's yours?" Clementine asked, eyes scanning the roofline, where a crow perched like a watchman. Gideon nodded. "Built it 5 years ago. Took 2 summers off and on." She brought the wagon to a stop, and Abigail stirred in the back, blinking against the light. Andrew sat beside her, clutching the basket of eggs Reverend Mallory had given them as a parting gift. Neither child spoke, but both were watching the land like it might ask something of them. Gideon stepped to the back and lifted Abigail down, then reached for the sack of flour. He didn't offer to carry Clementine. He didn't need to. She was already climbing down, skirts gathered in one hand, boots landing solid on the earth. Inside, the cabin was cool and clean. A table stood against the far wall, its surface worn smooth by years of use. A ladder led up to the loft, and a narrow window near the hearth let in a shaft of sun. The scent was wood smoke and something faintly herbal, not sweet, but grounding. "Dried cedar," Gideon said, stepping in behind her. "I hang it in the rafters every winter." Clementine traced a finger along the shelf above the hearth. "It smells like someone lives here." He set the flour on the table. "I never let it go cold." Andrew stepped in, holding the basket as if it might shatter. "Where do we sleep?" Gideon pointed toward the corner. "You'll have the loft. There's wool up there and 2 blankets. It gets warm by sundown." Abigail tugged at Clementine's skirts. "Can I stay with you?" Clementine crouched beside her. "You'll be just above me. Close enough to hear if you whisper." The girl nodded solemnly, then turned to explore the room, her fingers trailing along the edge of the table. Gideon leaned against the doorframe, watching. "You always know what to say." "I was the oldest of 6, she said, straightening. "There's a rhythm to young ones. You just have to listen for it." He lifted an eyebrow. "And grown men." She tilted her head, considering. "They're harder. Don't always know their own tune." He didn't look away. "Would you try anyway?" Her breath caught for the briefest moment. If he made room for it. He nodded once, then pushed off the door frame and walked toward the lean-to. She watched him go, then turned to the children. "Let's unpack. We'll want beds made before the sun drops." They worked through the heat of the afternoon, spreading out the few things they owned. Clementine took the lower cot, near the hearth, and folded the quilt Mallory's wife had pressed into her hands the morning they left. Andrew swept the loft with a cedar branch, and Abigail arranged the wooden spoons on the shelf by size, humming as she worked. By the time dusk colored the sky, the cabin felt less like a place they'd arrived at and more like one they'd chosen. Gideon returned with a bundle of wild onions and a rabbit slung over one shoulder. He set them down without comment, then knelt to stoke the fire. Clementine handed him the pot without needing to be asked. As the stew simmered, they sat outside on the split log bench while the children napped. The silence between them wasn't heavy, just full. "Where'd you learn to trap?" she asked after a while. "My uncle. He raised me after my folks died. Taught me to read a trail, skin clean, waste nothing." She folded her arms against the cooling breeze. "You don't speak of him much. He was a harsh man. Fair, but not gentle. And you?" Gideon glanced sideways at her. "I try to be better." The wind stirred the grass beyond the fence. Clementine watched it bend, then right itself. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For not letting me sit by the road and turn to dust." He reached for her hand, his grip firm but unhurried. "You were never going to turn to dust, Clementine." She let her fingers rest in his, warmth threading through the calluses and quiet. "Still," she said, "it matters that you saw me." He didn't answer, but he didn't let go either. Inside, the rabbit stew thickened, and the scent of rosemary drifted into the doorway. Clementine rose and moved toward it, the last light of the evening tracing her figure in gold. Gideon watched her, then followed. Not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. It rained the second week they were there. Not sudden, but steady gray mist at dawn, thickening into a soft downpour by midday. The kind of rain that quieted the land, made every sound feel closer. Gideon had sealed the chinks in the cabin walls well enough that no water came through, but the roof held a slow, rhythmic drip near the hearth that Clementine caught in a tin basin before it could spread. She sat near the window with a needle and thread, mending the hem of Andrew's shirt where it had torn at the elbow. The boy was on the floor with a whittling knife, shaping a sliver of sycamore into something like a bird. Abigail dozed on Gideon's lap, fingers tangled in the edge of his shirt, her breath even and deep. "You ever wish you'd stayed back east?" Gideon asked, his voice low enough not to wake the girl. Clementine tied off the stitch and bit the thread clean. "Not once I got here." He adjusted Abigail gently, settling her against his shoulder. "You had people there?" "An aunt in St. Joseph. She ran an ocean stall near the riverfront. She was kind in her way, but she didn't know what to do with me." Clementine folded the shirt and set it aside. "I think she thought I was too old to start over." Gideon watched her. "That why you answered the letter?" "I thought if a man wanted a wife by post, he might not mind a woman with her own thoughts." She glanced at him. "I wasn't expecting to be left behind before I even got there." "You weren't left behind," he said quietly. "You were found." She looked down at her hands, then back to him. "You always speak plain like that?" "I try not to add more words than I need." Andrew looked up from his carving. Do you think the chickens will be safe in the lean-to? It leaks. They'll be dry enough under that slant, Gideon said. But we can patch it come morning. I can help, Andrew offered. Gideon nodded. You've got a good eye for a straight line. I saw it when you braced the loft ladder. Andrew smiled, then bent back over his work. More focused now, the lines of his shoulders eased. Clementine rose and set the folded shirt on the shelf. We'll need more oil soon. The lamp's half gone. There's a trader in Elk Hollow. He comes through once a month. I can ride out and meet him. Gideon shifted Abigail slightly, brushing a leaf from her hair. Is there anything else? Needles, if he's got them. And cloves. Abigail's been coughing some at night. I'll see what I can trade. She hesitated by the door, watching the rain slip down the window pane. It's a fine thing, this place. Quiet in the right way. You don't mind the quiet? Not when it's full. He didn't answer, but the way he looked at her made the silence feel like something shared, not empty. That night, they ate late. Gideon had boiled beans with the last of the onion, and Clementine made a skillet cake with cornmeal and just enough sugar to keep the children from frowning. The four of them sat close by the hearth, bowls in hand, while the rain softened to a hush against the roof. Later, once the children were asleep, Clementine stepped outside with a blanket around her shoulders. The night air was still damp, but the clouds had thinned, letting a few stars peek through. She stood on the porch, listening to the frogs start up in the low brush near the spring. Gideon joined her a few minutes later, his steps quiet on the wood. You always come out when it rains? He asked. Only when it stops. He leaned against the post, arms crossed. I used to think I'd end up alone out here. Not because I wanted to. Just seemed like most folks I met didn't stay. Clementine turned to look at him fully. I'm not going. He nodded, then straightened. I know. They stood there together, no rush between them. The air smelled of wet soil and pine, and somewhere not far off, and all called once, then again. You don't have to love me today, Gideon said after a while. But I want to give you the kind of life where you could. I think I already do, she said, voice quiet but certain. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. And when they went back inside, the cabin felt warmer than it had before, not from the hearth but from something that had taken root between them, quiet and real. Morning would come, and there would be fences to fix, a roof to patch, and trade to be made. But none of that felt heavy. It felt like a life being built, piece by piece, in the right hands. The first frost came early that year, crisping the edges of the squash vines and painting the windows with a fine lace of ice just after dawn. Clementine woke before the others and pulled on her shawl, stepping out into the stillness with a basket under one arm and a sharp knife tucked into her apron. The pumpkins near the edge of the garden had gone pale overnight, but she managed to salvage 3 good ones before the sun crested the ridge. Inside, the cabin held the warmth from the banked fire. Abigail stirred beneath the quilt in the loft, and Andrew's breathing had the steady rhythm of a boy growing into his frame. Gideon, still half asleep, sat at the table polishing the barrel of the rifle with a cloth worn thin at the corners. You think it'll snow before All Saints? She asked, setting the basket on the bench. He glanced out the window. Could. That ridge catches the cold early. I'd like to stack more wood before it does. There's still the deadfall near the western slope. He folded the cloth and set it aside. You thinking we'd take the cart and cut it together? She untied her apron and hung it by the door. I was thinking I'd go alone. You've still got that gutter nail to fix on the porch. He raised an eyebrow. You trust yourself with the axe? She didn't answer, just looked at him until he gave a quiet nod. Already the mule, he said. By mid-morning, she was gone down the trail with the cart, her shoulders square beneath the wool, her braid tucked into the collar to keep the wind off her neck. Gideon spent the next hour on the porch, crouched low to hammer the bent gutter bracket back into place. Abigail brought him warm cider in a tin cup and sat beside him with a bundle of dried corn husks, trying to teach herself how to twist them into dolls. Andrew remained inside, bent over a slate and muttering his sums under his breath. The sun was slanting westward by the time Clementine returned. The cart was full, stacked high with clean oak and a few pieces of pine, and her sleeves were streaked with pitch. She looked flushed, but proud. I found a fallen elm, she said, hopping down. Not rotted through. Took some work, but it split clean. He met her at the cart, lifting one of the logs to test its weight. "You cut this yourself?" She nodded. "All but the knotted ones. Left those for another day." He looked at her, then reached for her hand. "You've got sap on your cheek." She let him wipe it with the edge of his sleeve. "You going to scold me for going alone?" "No," he said. "I'm going to ask you to marry me." Her breath hitched. "You already did. That wasn't with a ring." She blinked. "You have a ring?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. Inside was a simple band. A thin twist of gold with no stone, just the soft gleam of metal worn from being touched too often. "It was my mother's," he said. "She wore it until the fever took her. My uncle kept it in a box. Said I should give it to someone who'd make their own way." Clementine stared at it, then at him. "You've had it all this time?" "I was waiting for someone who could split elm with her own hands." She laughed, a sound that carried across the yard and into the trees. "Then yes," she said, "I'll wear it." He slipped it onto her finger, and for a long moment, they just stood there, the sun warm on their backs and the scent of cedar in the air. They married 2 weeks later, under the cottonwoods behind the cabin. Reverend Mallory came out from town with his wife, who brought boiled potatoes and a loaf of sweet brown bread. Andrew wore a coat that was too short in the arms, and Abigail carried a bouquet of dried asters tied with twine. There was no music, but Gideon held Clementine's hands and spoke his vows like he meant every word, and she answered with a voice steady as the earth beneath them. When it was done, she kissed him first, and he kissed her second, and the children clapped like thunder. Afterward, they ate on blankets spread across the yard, and Mrs. Mallory brought out a pie from a basket and said it was store-bought, but nobody cared. Gideon built a fire that night, and they all sat close, the sky full of stars and the cold held at bay by the kind of warmth that came from more than wood. That winter, they stayed tucked close to the hearth. Clementine taught Abigail how to read with the old primer Mallory had gifted them, and Andrew helped Gideon build a chicken coop with a slanted roof and straw-lined boxes. The days were short, but full of light in their own way. By spring, the orchard had bloomed early. Clementine stood under the plum trees one morning, hand resting on her belly where new life stirred, and Gideon came up behind her and pressed a kiss to her neck. "You think we'll be ready?" she asked. "We already are," he said. And they were. The land grew around them. The children grew too, Abigail chasing chickens with a ribbon in her hair, Andrew carving careful letters into the barn door to mark the seasons. Clementine kept her voice steady and her back straight, and Gideon never let a day pass without touching her hand or brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. They were not grand people, but they were steady, and they were full of love. It was not the life Clementine had imagined when she left Missouri. It was better. She had not been chosen by a man in a letter. She had been seen, truly seen, by the quiet man who helped her stand. And together they built something that would not blow away with the prairie wind. And they lived, all 4 of them, in a house that smelled of cedar and bread and new beginnings. Together, always.